Arkadaşlar merhaba. Sosyal hizmetleri yeniden düşünmek konferanslarımızın dizisinin şu anda yaptığımız konferansa hoş geldiniz. Bu 8. konferansımız. Bu konferanslara biz 2011 yılında başladık. Konferansa kayıt için girdiğiniz internet sayfasında daha önceki konferanslarımızın üzerine bilgiye ulaşabilirsiniz. Buraya baktığınızda geçmiş konferanslarımızın programlarını incelediğinizde düzenlediğimiz konferanslarla sosyal hizmetin güncel sorunlarını Türkiye özelinde ele aldığımızı göreceksiniz. Aynı düşünceyle bugün ve yarın yapacağımız konferansta da pandeminin toplum üzerinde mevcut ve olası etkilerini ve bunların da bu sürecin sosyal hizmete nasıl etkilediğini ele alacağız. Bunları tartışacağız. Bu yıl pandemi toplumsal yaşantımızı birçok yönden kökten etkiledi. Toplumsal yaşantımız ve ekonomik yapılar sarsıldı. Karantina ve fiziki mesafe uygulamalarıyla şimdiye kadar alıştığımız aile içi ilişkiler, çalışma hayatımız, sosyal ilişki alanındaki siyasal, kültürel etkinliklere kadar bir dizi alanda alıştığımız pratiklerin dışına düştük. Yeni pratikler geliştirmek zorunda da kaldık. Covid-19 pandemisi tıbbi gelişmelere bağlı olarak sonlanacaktır. Ancak toplumsal yapıda ortaya çıkan değişiklikler kalıcı olacaktır ya da olabilir. Bunların neler olacağı konusunda da bugünden kestirmek oldukça zor. Ancak pandeminin derinleştiği toplumsal eşitsizlikler, kadınların omuzlarına binen ek yük, belirli gruplara yönelik ön yargılar, işsizlik, yoksulluk, sağlığa, eğitime ve sosyal haklara erişim konusunda yaşanan sorunlar gibi alanlar önümüze gelecek ve sosyal hizmet bunlarla ilgilenmek zorunda kalacak. Sosyal hizmette pandemiden derin etkilenen alanlardan birisi Covid-19 salgını, sosyal hizmetlerin tasarlanması, sunumu, yönetsel ve yapısal değişim gereksinimini gün yüzüne çıkarmış durumda. Sosyal hizmet altyapısındaki eksiklikler daha görünür hale geldi. Özellikle bilgi ve uygulamadaki eksiklikler ve sosyal hizmet etiği açısından belli boşlukların olduğunu fark ettik. Bu konferansa pandeminin toplum üzerindeki mevcut ve olası kalıcı etkilerini ve bu süreçte sosyal hizmetin konumlanışını ele almayı istiyoruz. Bunu yaparken de konferans hem uluslararası hem de yerel düzeyde deneyimlerin paylaşılması, pandeminin göç, yoksulluk, toplumsal cinsiyet eksenlerinde derinleştirdiği eşitsizlikleri ve bu çerçevede sosyal hizmet müdahalelerini tartışmak, masaya yatırmak istiyoruz. Bir konuya daha girmek istiyorum. Burada bu yıl aramızdan ayrılan doçent doktor Ertan Kahramanoğlu hocamızı burada anmak istiyorum. Ertan hocamız sosyal hizmetin Türkiye'de hem teorik alanda hem de uygulama alanında görünür olmasında en çok emeği geçen hocamızdır. Bu konferansın düzenlenmesinde de konuların saplanmasında da bize yol gösteren bir hocamız olmuştur. Ertan Hoca ile uzun yıllar beraber çalışan Profesör Doktor Işıl Bulut hocamız bugün aramızda. Kendisi şimdi kısaca bir anma konuşması yapacak. Sözü Işıl hocamıza bırakıyorum. Buyurun hocam.
Teşekkür ederim. Bana bu şansı verdiğiniz için çok teşekkür ederim size. Sevgili Ertan benim 50 yılı aşkın bir süredir arkadaşımdı. Üniversitede beraber okuduk. Hacettepe Üniversitesi Sosyal Hizmetler Yüksekokulu'nda yıllarca birlikte çalıştık. Müdür yardımcısı olduk. Aynı odada oturduk. Ondan sonra 2002 yılında Başkent Üniversitesi Sağlık Bilimleri Fakültesi'nde Sosyal Hizmet bölümünü kurduk. Ve gene orada da birlikte çalışmalarımıza devam ettik. Ertan benim her zaman arkamda olan, sırtımı dayayabileceğim bir arkadaşımdı. Ve çeşitli sempozyumlara katıldık. sosyalizmi yeniden düşünmek konusunda sizin yaptığınız değerli toplantılar, değerli sempozyumlarda gerek hazırlık komitesinde gerekse konferans, kongre sırasında yer aldık. Çeşitli kongrelere, konferanslara yurt içi ve yurt dışında birlikte katıldık. Grup psikoterapileri, Bergama'da grup psikoterapileri sempozyumlarını birlikte yaptık. Şunu söylemek istiyorum ki Ertan sosyal hizmetin babasıydı bana göre. Çünkü sosyal hizmete ilişkin yaşamında çok şey yaptı. Hatta Sosyal Hizmetler Genel Müdürlüğü yaptığı bir dönem de oldu. 2828 sayılı Sosyal Hizmetler ve Çocuk Esirgeme Kurumu Kanunu'nu Ertan Hoca'nın büyük etkileriyle çıkarılması mümkün oldu kanununun. Bu arada tabii yani yurt içi ve yurt dışında çeşitli toplantılara birlikte katıldık. Ve tabii Ertan'la ilgili benim söylemek istediğim çok şey var. Çok anılarımız var. Ama burada sizin zamanınızı almak istemiyorum. Şunu söylemek istiyorum. Biz böyle ölüm konuştuğumuz zaman ben derdim ki ben senden önce öleceğim. Sen bana toprak atacaksın. Fakat bunun tersi oldu maalesef. Ben ona toprak atmak zorunda kaldım. Ve insanın bu kadar yakın bir arkadaşını kaybetmiş olması hakikaten üzücü bir durum. Bu arada Sosyal Hizmetin Tarihçesi adı altında bir kitap çıkarmaya hazırlanıyordu. Bütün kaynaklarını topladı. Dünya kadar kaynağı var zaten. Ve bunu gerçekleştirmek için de bir küçük daire satın aldı. Orasını kütüphane yapacaktı aynı zamanda. Fakat buna başlamaya zamanı olmadı. Bir nehir söyleşi yapılacaktı. Hastalığı buna el vermedi. Bu nedenle ışıklar içinde uyusun diyorum. Ve Profesör Doktor Sayın Uğur Tekin'e bana bu fırsatı verdiği için de özellikle teşekkür ediyorum.
Biz teşekkür ederiz hocam. Katıldığınız için gerçekten Erkan Kahramanoğlu hocamız bizi yönlendiren hocamızıydı. Kaybetmek hepimiz için bir kayıp oldu. Sosyal hizmet camiası için önemli bir kayıp bizim açımızdan. Şimdi arkadaşlar birinci oturuma geçiyoruz. Birinci oturumumuzun konusu pandemi, toplum ve sosyal hizmet. Bir giriş oturumu olarak düşünüldü. Bu oturumda 3 konuşmacımız var. 3 konuşmacımız da yurt dışından katılıyorlar. Sinan Birdal şu anda Berlin'de bağlanmış durumda. Dr. Rory Turrell halen bağlanmamıştı. Sanırım süreç içinde bağlanacaktır. Caroline Schmidt, Mainz Üniversitesi'nden katılıyor, Almanya'dan. Toplantımıza biraz normal saatinden biz giriş konuşması kısa tuttuğumuz için vakit kazandık ama ben yine de toplantıya başlatmak istiyorum. Rejiyi yapan arkadaşlar açısından da bir sorun yoktur herhalde. Biz toplantıya birinci oturum olarak başlıyoruz. Şimdi çeviri içinde bir sorun olacağını sanmıyorum. Böyle bir sorun var ise gelecek arkadaş bildirirse iyi olur. Ben toplantıyı başlatıyorum. Birinci toplantımız dediğim gibi pandemi, toplum ve sosyal hizmet genel bir giriş oturumu olarak düşünüldü. İlk konuşmacı da Dr. Sinan Birdal. Sinan şu anda Almanya'da.
Sinan right now is in Germany and he works as a researcher and I hope you can hear this interpreter, by the way. I just took over. So I'll now give the floor to Sinan himself, and he will give you information, and he will be talking about the sociology of the pandemic. So the floor is yours, Sinan. Thank you so much. Now, today, within my time limits, I would like to talk about a couple of things. One of them is the following: the relationship between the society and the pandemic at an analytical level. And secondly, within the context of world history, I'll try to look at pandemics. And thirdly, globalization and pandemics and the relationship between the two. And I'll try to look at the short-term future and try to come up with some predictions. The first thing, now, as we talk and discuss about the pandemic, I mean, on the media and by public at large, now we focus on the virus and the pathogenity. Mostly, I mean, how to combat the virus, how about vaccines, are they being developed? Is it possible to develop vaccines? And how about spreading among people? And how to stop it. Of course, it's natural and understandable that the discussion is along these lines. But on the other hand, though, as far as this pandemic is concerned, we shouldn't see this pandemic only about the virus, because the virus, yes, I mean, perhaps and most probably it came from the body of a bat, and the bat was just sitting in the forest. The virus was sitting in the body of the bat in the forest, and somehow the virus left that environment and it spread around the world, and it did it within a short period of time, only within a couple of months. And it spread over to the whole world. But I mean, the virus alone cannot explain this. The virus is not to be blamed here. I mean, the virus didn't get on a plane or get on a train and did not start traveling around the world after all. So then how did it spread around? Or rather, what we call the contagion or the pandemic, how did it come about? Now, we need to look at a couple of things here. Evolutionary biology and the geography of pandemics, contagions, is what I will focus on. And the Rob Wallace, who is an expert on pandemic geographies, is what I looked at. We need to look at a couple of things here. One of them is capital markets, i.e. economic activity, and how it gets spread out and how it expands on the geography relevant to this. What I will underline in a minute is the following. Cattle breeding and agricultural investments are relevant, and some developmental projects are relevant, and urban and rural policies also. Likewise, health and work policies are relevant, and of course, transportation systems are, because as we all are aware, this is a disease which is spread from person to person. So we're talking about systems which transmit it from one place to another, which we also need to take into account. So all of these things, all of these factors that I enumerated have turned a pathogen, a virus, into a global actor. But how? I mean, the fundamental question here, our starting point should be the following. I mean, how come it all started with a bat, as it is thought to have been the case? The virus came from the bat and was spread out to the whole world. How did this happen? Now, the biologist Rob Wallace, I mentioned, priorly, end of 1990s and beginning of 2000s, he focused his work on avian flu as a scientist, and as a scientist, as a biologist, he came up with some maps. and he attempted to understand how the virus spread. And at some point, as he was working on those maps, he realized the following: if you focus only on the virus, i.e., if you only concentrate on the biological processes, it's not possible to understand how the contagion spread. So in other words, he found himself in a situation where he had to take a step towards social sciences. That's where his research took him. So I think that was the first learning lesson for us, which is the following. This means that in order to understand such a complex phenomenon, we need to make sure that we have an interdisciplinary scheme and work and cooperation in mind, which is something to be underlined. It's really important, especially in the context of social services as a field. And several theses have been entertained for coronavirus so far. As you will remember, initially, especially, it was about the wet market in Wuhan. I mean, the wet market context, which you find in Asian countries, which is a setting where some traditional food items are sold. So that wet market was pointed out as the source of the virus. But a number of different sets of data made Rob Wallace hesitant, because he said, well, maybe it was this wet market, but maybe not. It didn't have to be that particular wet market, he thought. So what was the source? What was the root? Now, first of all, what we encounter is a situation as follows. In tropical regions, I mean, economic activity has been expanding into and towards tropical regions. And one such typical activity is deforestation, i.e., for agricultural and livestock activity. And in order to establish large farms, new pieces of land is needed, and tropical forests are entered into gradually. So a bat which is host to a virus doesn't need to have been sold in a wet market, because in fact, already for agricultural purposes and for livestock breeding purposes, people already had entered into that forest where that bat was living. So I think this is an important point, because as you can imagine, some racist and orientalist discourses emerged in this process, which targeted traditional food and cooking of China, the Chinese culture, or which criticized the wet markets in terms of health conditions. But in fact, the thing is, yes, it could have been that, but not necessarily, because already large agricultural companies and livestock companies had already started going into those areas, regions where those bats and other tropical animals live. So who goes into and enters those regions? Now, there are some leading holding companies, conglomerates, global ones, for example, Colgate, Palmolive, Johnson & Johnson. These companies are leaders in deforestation, but at the same time, what they do is, interestingly, and going back to what Rob Wallace focuses on here, they also fund research on global pathogens. So these global pathogens and viruses, which are subject to research, these pieces of research mainly focus on identifying those areas and zones where new pathogens can come out. Predominantly, these are tropical regions. And historian William McNeill, when he worked in 1970s on plagues and peoples in moderate climates like in the Mediterranean region, for example, biodiversity is reduced. But if you go to a tropical region, there is more biodiversity. And that holds true for all sorts of organisms. So that also holds true for viruses and pathogens alike. China, India, Latin America, and Africa, and particularly tropical regions of these countries, of course, come to the front in terms of such biological diversity. Now, research conducted classifies these areas as risky regions where new viruses or pathogens can come out. Generally, they mark these regions in red on maps as absolute prospective contagion regions. So in looking at it from a global perspective, this distorts our opinion. Why? Because first of all, and of course, by the way, this is a racist and colonial type of approach. Because if you look at these regions and local cultures in these regions, you see that for thousands of years, between human communities and nature, they have been able to strike a balance between nature and human communities. They are different than those commercial corporates and investment companies. They don't engage in economic activity which goes into the depths of forests. Rather, they have always tried to strike a balance between nature and human communities, as a result of which such biodiversity has been preserved. The main problem is the following. The main reason, the main root cause of the problem does not have to do with those local cultures or traditions. Rather, the root cause of the problem is the following. There are swine farms or chicken farms that these large companies try to open up, or they try to open up new pieces of land for agricultural activities. This is the kind of activity that those corporations engage in. That's important. Now, what's the starting point of those corporations? Now, we see this interesting pattern here. For example, again going back to a reference, an example by Rob Wallace. For example, Goldman Sachs in China, around where coronavirus first was seen, in a periphery of that region, there is an agricultural company which is active in that region, which is peripheral to the center of the pandemic, and Goldman Sachs co-owns that company. So it's not right to see those regions as absolute epicenters of contagions. And we should rather look at different actors in those regions, how those actors have acted, and how the virus was put into circulation, and how those actors have been effective in that. So we see first world centers like New York, London. We see centers of global capital. And these are the starting points of such activity. So in other words, as we try to analyze the root cause of the pandemic, we shouldn't only focus on tropical regions or local cultures of those tropical regions. Rather, the main thing revolves around international capital groups which have been interfering into those regions. Rob Wallace, as a biologist, worked in those regions himself, but as he started voicing these opinions, his research funds were cut off. And China itself was instrumental in having Rob Wallace being kicked out of the World Health Organization, interestingly. Now, William McNeill now, briefly. In writing of world history, he was a significant name. Now, Plagues and Peoples was a book he wrote in 1976. This book, I believe, is really important due to a couple of reasons. First of all, as I said, indeed, he is one of rare scholars who wrote world history. And secondly, in 1970s, 70s was not a decade where people were talking a lot about contagions or pandemics. Rather, social state was still to a certain extent functional. And there was a lot of trust in confidence in medicine. And in the 70s, vis-a-vis diseases, people thought medicine as a science was trustworthy. So that was how 70s were. So I think because of this, the book is important, because in the world history, plagues and contagions cause important changes, he says in the book. And contagions still occupy an important place in world history, he says. Now, an important theory is formulated by McNeill here. He says the following: throughout history, there have been two different types of parasites humans had to fight against. One is microparasites, and they are all over the place. They were all over the place. They were pervasive in Mesopotamia, for example. When first agricultural activities started, first people tried to control water, or in Asia, likewise, perhaps in rice fields, either for rice or non-rice agriculture, people had to engage in agricultural activities, and for irrigation purposes, they always, humans always had to be involved with and be in interaction with parasites. And he talks about a long period in history when, during which time this all happened. And most probably some societies during those periods of time were weakened by parasites, and they were defeated by parasites, and they were invaded by other societies in turn, or were enslaved by other societies after they were weakened and started being used as workers. Well, we're not talking about a written history here. Of course, he tells all this as speculation. But here he says the following. He questions this process, but at the same time, he says in human societies, there are some structures which protect human communities and societies against foreign occupation. These are particularly military structures, and at the end of the day, it is the state. So McNeill defines the state as a microparasite, and he says, is this a sustainable parasite or not? Now, the occupiers who are holding weapons versus workers on the field, and he looks at the relationship between these two groups.
And he says if we just deprive those people who produce the product of all their product, then we will also starve, because in this case, we will only need to deprive them of their product, part of their product, and not all of their product. So McNeill argues that human societies in turn developed a kind of immunity, an immunity against microparasites, as well as economic exploitation. And he calls this sustainable parasitism. So this, in fact, is quite interesting, because this is, in fact, what is usually defined as civilization and affirmed by everybody in the history. However, McNeill argues that the whole thing is based on parasitism. So in the globalization process, how can we reinterpret this? Well, I made a lot of use of not only McNeill, but also of literature on the emergence of AIDS at the end of 70s, and there was a lot of reference in the writings about how health policies were influenced by the contagions. As I've stated, and as McNeill also emphasized, neither the contagions are new, nor the patterns of their spread. Let's go back and think about plague, Black Death. The global plague had an impact on the entire global economy back then, and it worked on the economy because it had an impact and destroyed ports, port cities, and commercial hubs. And it has also been working its way through our system in the same manner. If the Mongolian soldiers had not entered a village in the Himalayas, then this virus, which was contained in the village, would not have spread. Okay, I will try to conclude. Well, this is all a consequence of globalization, all this widespread contagion. And throughout world history, we observe that each contagion causes change in administration. New administration methods, new supervision methods get developed. But this is not anything that you can theorize on, because as far as I can see throughout history, each contagion uses the administrative techniques developed by an earlier contagion period, but it also develops new techniques and adds on the previous ones. And each time the administrators have to make some political choices, and those political choices, once they're made, become permanent, and they have an impact on the response on the next contagion. We are in an open-ended process right now. And specifically about the coronavirus, there are a few things that can be said. First and foremost, we have deepened social inequalities, and there is also some segregation, some geographical marginalization or ghettoing of certain territories. And we can always discuss these later. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Birdal. Ladies and gentlemen, we are in session 1. We're discussing pandemic society and social work. Now I'd like to give the floor to the second speaker. Second speaker is the Secretary General of International Federation of Social Work, Dr. Rory Turrell. He's going to address social work and transformational change at the time of COVID-19. You have the floor.
Oh, good morning and good afternoon to everybody. Thank you so much to the organisers for arranging this important event. Rethinking social work, transformational change is a very important topic right now for the social work profession and indeed for, I think, the sustainability of the world. So congratulations on choosing this topic at this time. I'd like to not just thank the organisers, I'd like to thank the translators. I was just listening to the previous speaker and the translation was very clear. Thank you so much to the translators for the work you're doing too. From the International Federation of Social Workers, I extend greetings from our International Executive, a global committee that is responsible for the governance of the social work profession. They're aware of this important event today and send their best wishes to all involved. I also want to especially acknowledge and thank social workers that are at the front line fighting against this pandemic. We know that they're under incredible pressure, and that we also know that they're making significant differences in saving people's lives. Indeed, one of the themes that I will speak more about as I go through my presentation is that this pandemic has really shown the world that social work is essential. It's an essential frontline service. It's an essential service to keep communities supported, to help productivity in society. And what we do know is that when we employ social workers, crime rates go down, less people need to go to hospital because there's more care in the community, more children go to school, and that there's a better return in the economy. So while we in the profession have known that social work is essential, what we've found is that through this pandemic, that governments have also started to become more aware of this. I hope that's also true for our colleagues in Turkey. I need to be updated on those local issues in Turkey. So social work was well in advance of many governments from throughout the world in responding to this virus. And I think that it's because as a profession, we've been through many viruses before. Within our generation, we've been through SARS, Ebola, and HIV. And one of the important lessons that we learned as a profession was that governments won't immediately realise that there is a social component to fighting a virus. Very often governments immediately assume that it's a medical issue. And indeed, that's what happened also in the first few weeks and months of the Corona-19 virus. The social work profession, however, acted in a different way. Our colleagues in China, from the very first days in January, alerted us to what they were doing and how they were managing the virus in Wuhan. And they too, like social workers throughout the world, didn't have instructions from their government, they didn't have information on how to manage a virus, and they moved immediately into crisis mode. And in fact, when talking with them at that time, they were working nearly 24 hours a day, not sleeping for days on end, trying to organise services. What they did in China in those early days set a template for social workers working throughout the world. And this is before the virus was known to have spread outside of China. They did extraordinary things. They first of all set up public helplines, telephone helplines that enabled the public to get information about the virus and how to stay safe. The social workers knew, having gone through SARS before in China, that social isolation was going to be particularly important at that moment in time. They knew that people must not panic and run outside and start to buy products. They knew that people needed to stay calm. And so they had an immediate response to provide information for people, to be able to listen to people's anxiety and to be able to help reduce that anxiety. They also set up services for vulnerable people. So people that had mental health challenges, people that needed regular medical support, and people that had drug and alcohol issues. So immediately within the first 2 weeks of the virus becoming aware in Wuhan, the Social Work Association there had set up a number of services which gained support from the government, and they were able to spread throughout the whole of China. In addition to online services, telephone services, and web-based services, where it was safe, they also went and knocked on people's doors and asked people to make groups online within communities to support each other, to keep an eye on each other, and to find out how to access information. So the Chinese Association of Social Workers sent IFSW a report of what they were doing, and we were able to disseminate that very early in February. And this was well before the virus was known to be spreading out into other countries, although it was clear that it was going to at some point. Consequently, many social worker organisations followed suit, and they started to set up hotlines and web-based support systems. They started to challenge within their places of employment. How are we going to focus? How are we going to support homeless people, for example? How are we going to support people in aged care facilities where they're particularly vulnerable to this kind of virus? And as the virus started to spread outside, one of the earlier countries it went to was South Korea, and outside China, of course. And there, the social workers took unprecedented actions in making a sacrifice of their own personal lives, and decided to do things like work in shifts, 2-week shifts, where they would live in an elder age resident home for 2 weeks, and then they would go out for 2 weeks, and then another shift of social workers would go in for 2 weeks. And not just social workers, nurses and doctors did this as well. And this reduced the likelihood or the potential for the virus to be coming in and out every day. And of course, the workers were monitoring themselves as to whether they had any symptoms and so forth. So these were quite difficult decisions for social workers to make. They had to, at a time when everybody was very anxious in these early days of the virus, decide not to stay at home with their families. They actually decided to prioritise their work and protecting the public and protecting the people that they work with. So it was very courageous of these workers to do so. And in countries like South Korea, that's been widely acknowledged as a huge contribution from social work. The virus then spread, of course, into outside of Asia Central, and then it particularly spread into Italy when it came into Europe in these early days. And a number of the European governments started to take measures of lockdown, and as we suspected, they initially wanted to lock down everything, and the social workers fought and campaigned and advocated that social services should not be locked down, that social services should be remaining open, and that they should adapt to the conditions. So we had delegations of social workers going to see their ministers in government saying, please do not stop, do not lock down social services. They're needed more now than ever. And please make sure that they remain open, and we will work with them, and other professionals will work with them to adapt to the situation. So information again would be online and via hotline telephone systems. And one of the first countries that had locked down everything that social workers were successful in advocating change was Romania. And so by the time other countries, the United Kingdom and Switzerland and Germany and other countries went into lockdown, the governments had started to talk to each other, and they'd actually started to realise that they can't lock all the social services down. They needed to keep them open in order to make this approach to preventing or eliminating the virus work. They needed social services, and they needed social service involvement. We had huge shifts occurring in social services in this time, around March, April. Huge, massive shifts. We had different bits of governments talking to each other, different bits of the social services. We had police and education and health and welfare picking up the telephone where they never used to before and saying, this is what we're doing, this is the resources we have, can you help us, or how can we help you? And so there was something about this crisis which actually helped overcome many of the challenges that we see, the silos that we see inside the wider social services system, as people were forced really to work together in a different way. It's of course really unfortunate that it takes a crisis to create some kind of shift in the way social services can work. But this is a reality we've seen, and it's really important that we understand how that happened in order to try to keep all the gains that have been made moving forward. So extraordinary things happened in a number of countries. For the first time, many governments saw that homeless people were going to have some kind of form of support in order to not spread the virus in the streets. And so as tourism declined under lockdown, hotels became available and motels came available. Many of the middle income countries and higher income countries found resources to be able to support drug addicts and homeless people into temporary accommodation, which we've never seen before. This was an enormous challenge for our profession as well. And what many of our profession social workers found throughout the world was trying to bring people from the streets into accommodation. There was a certain level of resistance by a minority of them. And very often that was access to drugs, access to supportive relationships in the streets, and social workers were deeply involved in trying to help maintain people's street communities, but in a context of self-isolation within hotels. It was very complex work. So we saw an enormous set of changes happening within weeks, which normally we would not expect to see take place in months or years happening, as everybody felt some sense of involvement with trying to find answers to slow the spread of the virus. And social workers were also placed under enormous ethical dilemmas and challenges during this time, because of course throughout the world nobody was working to any template or policy or guidance document. They were making it up as they went along based on previous experiences of different diseases or what they had learned from other social workers in other countries on the way that they had responded to different viruses. So we had all sorts of challenges. In Italy, social workers were talking with each other to say, look, the morgue is full. There's too many dead people. There are too many people who have died from the virus to go to hospital. So they're now lining the bodies up in the church. Should I tell the family that their grandmother is lying in the church? Because if I do, with the Italian culture, they will break the curfew, they'll break the lockdown, and they will go and take the body and bring her back home. What is the professional, ethical, right thing to do in that situation? That was a very typical challenge that many social workers had to deal with at that time. In Sierra Leone, social workers were saying that the processes for people to attend marketplaces and buy food for sustainability and living, just to eat, to avoid starvation, was severely reduced. Now, excuse me, one of the problems with working from home is that I have to just do something with the dog. Just one moment, please, just one moment. Okay, well, this is my dog, everybody. I'm sorry, it's not very professional, working from home. So Sierra Leone, they had huge problems with rural communities being able to access food. And so social workers were able to get permission from the government to themselves break the curfew legally, go to the rural communities and say, look, you've been through Ebola before. You know about social distancing. You also know about growing different crops at this time, if it's possible. You know about sharing resources and food. You know that this village has this resource and you have this resource. You have to not use the marketplace. You have to safely work between yourselves in order to be able to get the food that you need. They also encouraged the rural villages in Sierra Leone to set up different kinds of manufacturing. So under Ebola, the villagers had made soap as a basic hygiene product. And the social workers said, look, you know how to make soap. There's palm oil in the fields here. Make soap. You can sell soap. You can use soap. You can trade soap. So typical of social workers is never just to look at one problem in isolation, but to look at the whole capacity of the village or the community to be able to transform into a better context. And the social workers used this crisis in Sierra Leone and in many other African countries in order to help build the economy and build the responsibility of the community to look after itself, to look after others in order to move forward. There were other huge challenges for social workers, and they remain so in terms of protective equipment, masks, gloves, disinfectant, and those sorts of issues throughout the world. So social workers, again, in many communities, got the communities to make masks for themselves and to be able to sell masks, to make disinfectant, to make gloves also. So social workers are very practical people, and when they walk into a community, into an isolated community, and the community is very distressed, one of the questions the social workers might ask is, how many sewing machines do you have in this community? How many people can operate sewing machines? How many people, where can materials come from for you to make safety equipment? And so those are the kinds of questions that lead to a more empowering answer with a huge context of limited resources. So we've seen shifts in social services which have come about through people's fear and needing an understanding to work together, and we've seen social workers working in a very dynamic, spontaneous way, taking enormous responsibility, putting their own selves at risk, sacrificing sometimes their family relationships in order to make a positive impact socially on people. And social workers didn't just stop
If you could
there.
maybe wrap up a little bit,
Yep.
says the chairperson.
Thank you so much, I will. Social workers didn't just stop there. They also worked together online across the world to say, now is the time for us to have a new strategy to rethink what social services do. So the climax of this was that 20,000 social workers came together last July in a 4-day conference, and we agreed that social services need to radically transform and change. So social service provision throughout most of the world is based on the concept of when things have gone wrong, the social services step in. After the crisis has happened, after somebody's had lost their job, their children aren't going to school, after there's a food shortage, that's when social services come in. But now, as a consequence of this huge transformational shift that is occurring within social services and the visibility of social work, we're saying our job for the next 10 years is to rethink social service delivery and to bring about a new form of social service delivery where we are working to prevent crisis. And our job is to support community development and community capacity so that social services are preventative of social crisis. So a 5-point plan has been developed by the social work profession to advance this over a 10-year period, which is really exciting. The plan's at risk, of course, because there will be many parts of society and governments that want to go back to business as usual as it was. And our job is not to let that happen. Our job is to keep focusing on the transformation of social service delivery as a key part of social services, a key profession within social services. So I see my time has run out. Apologies for my interruption with my dog. Thank you so much to everybody. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I'm really happy to be a part of a discussion and question and answers later. Thank you so much.
Çok teşekkür ederiz.
We thank you very much. We thank you very much, Rory. This was very interesting. And now I would like to move on to the third speaker of this first part, Dr. Caroline Schmidt from Mainz University. And her presentation is about sustainability, social services as disaster relief and inclusion. Now, I would like to give the floor to her, and once her presentation is done, I will open this session to question and answers. You can write your questions to the chat box, but please indicate who the question is for. Caroline, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ugur, and thank you to everyone for the great organization. I will share my slides now with you. I hope it will work out. So we will see. So maybe, Ugur, I see your face. Is it working? Do you see my slides?
Yes, we can see your slides.
Perfect. Then I will start. Yeah, thank you. I'm happy to have the opportunity to exchange ideas with you now. The title of my lecture is Inclusion, Internationality, Sustainability, Reflections on Social Work as Disaster Relief. And to me, it is important to say these are first reflections. I see myself as a searcher, as a seeker in this field of social work and disaster relief. And these ideas go in the direction to place social work more strongly in the field of disaster relief based on the challenges that we can all see now in the wake of the corona pandemic. So my lecture will be structured as follows. So first I will give a short introduction, then I will say something, what is actually meant by the term disaster and how the disaster relief is organized. Then I will give a short insight into the state of research on social work as disaster relief. And I will conclude with some ideas what could be the specifics of social work in the field of disaster relief. And I would love to discuss that with you as well. I come to the introduction, and I will, this perfectly fits because I will cite Rory Turrell now, the lecture before me. And you distinguishes between the challenges during the pandemic, and Turrell shows like 4 different phases. The first one is making governments recognize that the social response is imperative. The second, advocating for social services to remain open during lockdown. We heard about that in the lecture before. And adapting social services to a new world, managing ethical dilemmas. And fourth, integrating transformative practice and remaining fluid in approach. So the lecture is dedicated to the 4th point. And we can say it searches for old and new perspectives of social work in a time of crisis. My starting point is an understanding of the corona pandemic as a global disaster. Disasters such as the pandemic, they illustrate us a shared vulnerability of all or many people, of whole communities, but also of animals, plants, and the social subsystems like economy. But the pandemic also shows that some suffer harder than others. So what we heard also from Sinan Birdal is that we have an intensification of social inequalities. Rory Turrell said it as well. The pandemic cannot be seen solely as a health crisis in a narrow sense. So we need a global view. And in my view, the pandemic could act as an impulse for social work to further develop a social work as disaster relief. When we look now at the current situation, everyone is talking about the corona pandemic, but we also see that the pandemic is interlocked with other extreme events. And Walton and Van Aals, they speak of so-called overlapping disasters. And for this year, so the figures are from September 2020, they identify 132 weather-related disasters interacting with the corona pandemic. And even when we look back at the last few days, we had again, like for example, the earthquake affecting Turkey. And they put some figures. I think it's just important to keep that in mind, because there are more than 400 million people affected by extreme heat, in addition to the corona pandemic, and more than 50 million people affected by flood disasters, droughts, storms. So we see that there is an urgent need of social work to get a voice in disaster relief, even beyond this specific pandemic we have now. So why is it an issue of social work? We see it in these days quite obvious that already marginalized people and groups become even more marginalized in the event of a disaster and also beyond. And this is an idea from Rainer Treptow. He says what we can observe now, quite obvious, that the sole availability of support does not automatically mean that all people are provided with support equally, regardless of their gender, nationality, age, or religion. So this is a topic of inclusion and anti-racist issue in social work. I come to my second point now. So what is actually meant by the term disaster, and how is a disaster relief organized? When we look at the term disaster, we find many different definitions in research, and it's an interdisciplinary topic, of course. And Stefan Villa from Cultural Studies, for example, he shows that especially in cultural studies, disasters are focused quite a lot from the process, from the idea of social classification. So extreme events that get classified as social as a disaster. And Willer argues that it's an important perspective because it also shows up which issues are discussed in the public and which issues not, so which events not. But he also says it's a limited perspective because it does not take into account enough the causes and effects of disasters. So it may be helpful to look for further understandings of the term. Another understanding is from Schöneberger and colleagues. It's from business sciences. They say a disaster is an extreme and mostly sudden event with huge damage to the existential foundations of society. Adams distinguishes between natural disasters, such as earthquakes, human-made disasters, such as terrorist attacks, and the interaction between the two, as in the case of landslides, for example, with a cause in a specific management of land. I brought another definition from the United Nations International Strategy for Disaster Reduction, and they define a disaster as, quote, a serious disruption of the functioning of a community or society causing widespread human, material, economic, or environmental losses which exceed the ability of the affected community or society to cope using its own resources. A disaster is a function of the risk process. It results from the combination of hazards, conditions of vulnerability, and insufficient capacity or measures to reduce the potential negative consequences of a risk. So in my view, this could be a working definition that makes it possible to approach the effects of pandemics, natural disasters, or chemical accidents as well from a social work perspective. Having that definition in mind, we come now to the way the disaster relief is organized. So it's an interprofessional field. We can think of psychologists, physicians, toxicologists, deminers, also like experts in the construction industry, agriculture, but also it's a field of social workers. And disaster relief means a form of emergency aid, of course, but also support in the recovery phase and prevention work in the post-disaster phase. I tried to bring that in a sketch. So from a local to international level, we have different forms of organizations, like community-based organizations, but also state authorities. I'm in Germany now, so here we have different federal states with their own laws, and at the national level we have a body called Federal Office for Civil Protection and Disaster Assistance, where information on disasters are reported and activities are activated. But we also have on the international level organizations such as Caritas International, the International Red Cross, but also the UN Refugee Agency or Doctors Without Borders, CARE International. And in year 2000, the United Nations also set up an own office called the United Nations Office for Disaster Reduction. And since the year 2015, they have it's a so-called Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction 2015 to 2030. So the goal of the program is a global reduction and prevention of disaster. For example, that was also like licensed by the European Union. Yet in the annual report from this Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, these are the figures for year 2019 now. The UNDRR reports that 81 states have established a national disaster risk strategy so far, according to that framework. More than 4,000 cities participate in campaigns for urban resilience, and more than 4,000 employees participated in training programs concerning disaster relief. Yeah, I come to the question now, how, why social work as a disaster relief? How could that look like? It's a topic in social work research and in practice, of course. So I'm working in Germany, and in Germany, social work disaster relief has received little attention so far, although there are some work that has been published already by Rainer Treptow and Christiane Bär. Compared to the debate in Germany, the international debate is advanced. And especially it is driven forward by researchers in
araştırmacılar tarafından buna önem veriliyor.
Especially it is driven forward by researchers in countries that are repeatedly hit hard by natural disasters, such as Bangladesh, Chile, Indonesia, and the US. And we can say it's a field in the making. When we look, for example, at the US, we see that social workers are providing disaster relief for a longer time already, and there are forms of disaster risk management established. For example, also discussed in the literature by Mathboer and Borussa is the concept like 3 steps to building up social capital in and beyond a disaster. And it's about creating linkages between communities, to link communities with financial and political authorities and non-governmental organizations. And also social workers are working in disaster mental health services. So we could say a challenge maybe outgoing from the corona pandemic is to implement a social disaster relief for all people worldwide, taking into account local specifics as well. Future needs are also evident in terms of intersectionality and empowerment. This is a study from Pittaway, Bartolome, and Rees. And these colleagues, they have examined the tsunami disaster of December 2004, in which 8 countries have been hit by large tidal waves, such as Sri Lanka, India, Thailand. We see also here that a disaster can be an international situation, and more than 230,000 people died. 1.5 million people lost their home. And the authors show now that women and girls, they were less often able to swim, and also boat rescues, for example, were made more difficult by the fact that women, when their clothes were washed away in the floods, they did not want to go unclothed to men in lifeboats. And also in the emergency shelters, positions in the camp administrations were mainly filled by men. So the authors conclude that the needs and concerns of women were not heard enough during and beyond the disaster. And dealing with the corona pandemic too, we can observe that social inequality increases. And for example, we have protection measures, but for example, like we will hear that later, people in refugee camps are hardly marginalized. When we consider the fact now that disasters increase social inequalities, we can say that is like where social work is important with its approaches of advocacy work, intersectional, inclusive and empowerment strategies in and beyond the disaster. And it finds its cooperation partners on all levels, from the local to the international level. And Christiane Bär, for example, she points out that especially in the cooperation of support alliance from countries of the global north with people and professionals from the countries of the global south, that attention must be paid to partnerships based on equality and to prevent like colonization in the field of disaster relief. We can look also on the social workers themselves and their activities, and it's a quite demanding field. This is a study from Noguchi and team, and they illustrate in their study where they've led 12 interviews with social workers, and these social workers provided disaster relief in March 2011 after the reactor disaster in Fukushima. And the authors show that the burden on the professionals, they continue even years after the disaster. So the interviewees still struggle with feelings of helplessness, fear about their health condition and the health situation of the atrophies and fatigue syndromes. Yeah, the results make clear how important a good support infrastructure is for the social workers as well. This is also what Kamruyam and colleagues find out in an interview study with social workers who provided support in Bandung in Indonesia in the period 2015 to 2017 during flood disasters. So they showed that social workers were very engaged, but they reacted mainly spontaneously, and they call like for the duty on the side of the government to provide social workers with more support in the long term. This short view into the state of research maybe makes it quite clear that disaster relief is established quite differently depending upon place and country. And the social workers find different working conditions, and that requires like a flexible getting involved in the situation. And for sustainable education, this field could be implemented more in the curricula of social work, because it's also a cross-cutting theme whenever we discuss on the topic of climate change, migration, discrimination, racism, internationality. And I think there are lots of forward-looking impulses already in the literature from researchers in different countries that could be pushed forward. Yeah, I come to the conclusion now. We have seen disaster relief is an international and interprofessional field with growing relevance for social work. And also it's an interdisciplinary field and a task for us doing research, I would say. And in the field of practice, social work could get a stronger professional voice during disasters and beyond, because social inequalities, and we heard that already before, it's a social work topic. And when we have the principles of social work in mind, like creation of social change, social cohesion, social justice, and the recognition of local knowledge in disaster relief, it could be like these are three ideas how what could be specific perspectives of a social work disaster relief, like inclusive relief that recognizes all people with a special focus on marginalized people and groups, international because it's embedded in international fields with a specific focus also on cooperation on an eye level, and sustainable in the sense that it's about building up resilient communities in general in harmony with ecology, politics, like social development, and sustainable working condition. Yeah, I'm at the end of my talk now. So thank you very much. And I guess we're all looking forward to the discussion now.
Thank you. Now we will have the discussion section. You will be able to ask questions. You can ask your questions in writing, and we will compile those questions and convey them to the speakers. And we will then ask them to answer the questions. I already have one question. Rory Turrell is the person the question goes to. Globally speaking, what are the ethical values of social work is the question. The person who asks the question is Mehmet Türkmenoğlu. Now, I also have a question for Rory Turrell. Now, the behaviors of people, especially people who are detained or confined, they display different types of behaviors, and there are some problems that occur. People who are confined or detained, I mean, especially for those people who are confined, and for social work, even after the pandemic is over, maybe social work can be contextual. I mean, in order to overcome the problems that these confined people have had, even after the pandemic, perhaps you could give us ideas as to what kind of social work can be conducted. So why don't I now give the floor to you immediately for these two questions, Rory, and we will continue with other upcoming questions as they continue to come in.
Oh, thank you so much. So I think the first question related to what are the social work principles that drive the profession forward. There are many principles to social work, and the key document can be found on the IFSW website, which is called the Global Statement of Ethical Principles, and human rights, social justice are the two main headings of those, and then there's other principles listed under those. It's a really important question, and a question that we don't talk about enough within the profession, because social work is actually a principle-led profession. We believe that all people should have equal human rights. We believe that in order for that to occur, there needs to be environments of social justice for all people. How that happens is really important in social work, and one of the high-level principles that we often talk about is self-determination, so that people have the right to determine their own futures or to contribute to determining their own futures. And a fundamental job of all social workers is to work with a person, a family, or a community to help them identify how to influence their own future, how to self-determine, and how to realize their rights as citizens and as humans, and as members of a community and members of a society. And so self-determination is really, really key. It's, for me, the most important principle of social work, self-determination. And without that, we can't have, in my view, a context of human rights for all people. One of the things we know as social workers is that human rights need to be balanced. When we work with a family, almost any family, the rights of mum might be different from the rights of the child. The rights of the father, the rights of the uncle, the rights of the grandmother, the rights of the nephew, they may all have a different perspective on rights, and this is natural. Sometimes the grandmother's right for tradition in the family is different from the right of the child to express themselves in a different way. And so social workers have to work within that context of trying to get people to understand each other and to recognize each other's needs and to recognize each other's rights and find the right balance of rights. And this is quite a complex process which looks very different from the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. It's about balancing rights within a community and within a family. So it's about recognition of each other's fundamental rights to be able to exercise people's points of view, and to balance those in a social construct, in a social context. And we also have that within communities. Social workers work in divided communities, bringing people together to recognise each other's rights and to set a path forward for shared futures. Not shared future necessarily as in a singular, but shared futures as in plural, where people are able to engage and understand and ideally celebrate their diversity and their difference. Those are the sort of fundamental principles that drive social work forward. So we need more writings in social work. We need more people thinking about social work. And this kind of brings us to the second question. People who are in isolation might have their rights stripped of them. Lockdown did strip people of their rights, of their individual rights. When a government said you will be fined or imprisoned if you break the lockdown or break the curfew, that is an absolute breach of someone's individual rights. But we also have to be aware that there are social rights, and we have to balance the social rights. The social rights not to have the virus spread, the social right not to have someone cough in front of you in the street without wearing a mask, is a right, is a infringement against someone else's right. So again, I think this is a wonderful way of trying to understand the complexity that social workers work with every day, which is about balancing rights, social rights and individual rights, and also, of course, environmental rights, which has been brought up by the other two speakers in this panel so far, which is really great. And just coming back to the second question a little bit more, isolation can kill people. We know from the statisticians that social isolation is more dangerous than smoking cigarettes. You can smoke 2 packets of cigarettes a day, but if you're socially isolated over a long period of time, you're likely to die earlier than someone who smokes 2 packets of cigarettes a day. Social isolation is a terrible thing. We're social beings. We need socialization. We need people in our lives. That's a part of being human. And what we have to do under lockdown conditions is find new ways to socialize. And this is exactly what we're doing today. We're socializing, we're meeting new people, we're getting inspired by new people. I don't think it's the same myself as being able to do it face to face, but I think we've been able to learn a lot in a very short amount of time of how to fill our social spaces using technology like this. There will be challenges if this lockdown situation occurs for a very long time. A lot of challenges for children. People are very worried about the socialization of children under lockdown conditions. There's 2 ways to look at that. One is that it's terrible, and it is. And the other way, which is more positive, is that there's actually more family time. So in families that do not have economic threat because of loss of jobs hanging over them. So I'm talking about families that live in countries with good social protection systems. Social workers are reporting that there's more family quality time than there used to be before lockdown. So it's a mixed picture. But I've taken up enough time, and I want to leave more time for the other speakers. So thanks so much for the questions.
Biz teşekkür ederiz.
Thank you. One more question goes to Caroline Schmidt. Seeing disaster as an emotional breaking point, how would that add to social work and academic work?
Thank you for the question. I think the topic of emotions in general is a big issue in social work that could be further developed, in my view. And I think that it's absolutely important when we have people, for example, when we look at the corona pandemic in isolation, like in homes for elder people that cannot have their networks in general because the homes themselves are separated already. And during the pandemic, their situation gets even worse. Then we see, and they have like an emotion, for them it's an emotional, very, very hard situation. Then I think that the event of a disaster, what we have now, what we experience now, shows us what in general needs to be changed. And we have all the people in separated living conditions now, from homes for the elderly or in refugee camps. We also have other ways of living, other initiatives as well in that field that maybe come to the forefront now again. Because when I live isolated, the emotional work is an enormous task for social workers, and I think the idea of emotions really makes us aware of a very important point in social work. And it also points out, like it points out to a task on a face-to-face level, but also on the idea of structural change. So how can we create good communities, for example, of solidarity? I've seen in the program that will be the topic in the afternoon as well, because we have other ideas how people can live together beyond the disaster as well. So one example would be like a good doing research on the refugee accommodations. We have other ways of inclusive living that can be addressed now, maybe even better, also in public. So I think these, to make it to conclude, I guess the question of emotion, it's a general topic in social work. We can explore further on this idea of face-to-face work, but also from the what it shows us for structural changes. Yeah, thank you for the question.
Thank you very much. There are two questions to Sinan Birdal. I'm reading the questions now. Question 1. What can be the administrative techniques that may be introduced in the post-pandemic period? 2. How do contingents impact the politics? And can you please elaborate on this further? Thank you very much. Of course, some administrative techniques are already visible. Those are techniques that were employed in the previous contingents. In Turkey, we observed the lockdown. Lockdown was practiced at different levels in different countries. In Germany, they are applying a semi-lockdown. Cafes and restaurants are closed, movie theaters and theaters are closed, but you can go in the street. You have access to transportation, and you can go to stores. Well, in Turkey, we had a total lockdown for partial periods of time. But in Turkey's practice, there is something that's really interesting. For example, lockdown was practiced on certain groups, but not on others. In the US, they called them the essential workers, people who really need to work. And although the others did not have to go to work, the essential workers had to do that. And this is not only limited to healthcare or hospitals, but also it's applied to bus drivers and industrial workers. So people who are essential workers in Turkey is quite a large group. And this mainly depended on the economic concerns. Well, in fact, we see that there was a class discrimination in that case. And what can other techniques be? Lockdown is one of them. There is also the healthcare code that you receive from an application. I don't know how this code works because even people who are COVID positive can easily obtain this access code from the healthcare services over an application. This code is easily obtainable if you're positive, yet you don't have any symptoms. And this code is valid for 3 months. But this code controls movements, movements from one city to the next. Because in order to travel in the country, you have to obtain this code from the application. There are other projects. There was a project by a businessman group, Müsiyat, and that was a suggestion which said that the workers can be accommodated in accommodation facilities nearby industrial zones or in the industrial zones. Well, this is also class-based and it may have serious consequences to it from all perspectives, because then you wonder that what happens to these people who are obliged to work and then they may be obliged to reside in a certain area, and this could build into a kind of labor camp life, and this of course opens a new field of opportunities for the capital and the government. But on the other hand, we have a worker class which is completely disorganized, especially when it came to organized industrial zones. Maybe you could confine them in one single spot and house them in dormitories, and this may also be important for the workers to find an opportunity to cooperate and collaborate and maybe build new solidarities. We'll see how it works in the future if that suggestion holds, but it's an interesting process from the point of view of control and monitoring. It opens new areas of opportunity, but there is also a lot of opportunity to avoid control and monitoring. We'll see how it develops. But up until now, I have observed that first and foremost, although we were not very effective in fighting the contagion, the governments were quite good at diversifying the tools to control and monitor and supervise the society. We'll see how the society will respond to that attempt. And let me also talk about a little bit about the contagion. In various stages of the contagion, we'll see how this response changes. But first and foremost, there is the economic impact of the contagion. It, on one hand, challenges the politics, but on the other hand, it also gives them a lot of new opportunities. A lot of people are now looking up to the public authority. The public authority, which was not considered reliable for some time, was considered reliable during the early stages of the contagion. We don't know if this will be sustainable into the future. And secondly, because the contagion created a new crisis, a lot of people in the society are quite reluctant about a change in government now. And a lot of people think that in times of crisis, you have to hold on to what exists. There was already an economic stagnation, which was the case in Europe and more the case in Turkey. And people believe that it's maybe more advisable to prevent a government crisis on top of this economic crisis. But all of these are variables, and we'll see how it develops in the future. Thank you very much, Sinan. We don't have much time left, only 5 minutes. There is a question to Caroline Schmidt. In times of disaster and crisis, how should local governments act and what are the missions of a local government? If you could keep it a bit short, we'll have a chance to ask a few more questions. You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you for that important question. I have to say, to give a concrete advice, that's too early for me personal, because as I said, I'm a seeker in the field as well. But in general, I think a first step would be to really see the corona pandemic as a social crisis as well, and to be open for interprofessional cooperation and for cooperation also with non-governmental organizations without but still staying responsible, because we have so many solidarity initiatives which do a great job, but it would be not the right way in my view when then the local governments say, okay, let them do it, it will run somehow. So the question, I was also asking myself the question, do we need, for example, specific institutions for social work on the local level to get involved, sustainable in case of disasters, for example? I don't know, from an international perspective, to my view, the task is to analyze what we already have, and then really we could explore further more concrete action on the local level. At the moment, I would say, like, to accept and see it as a social crisis, as a social disaster, involve the people that are affected, that we need to talk to the people also, especially in the marginalized situations. What are their needs? I don't know, in my view, voices of the people if affected the most are maybe also the ones that are excluded when we go in the direction of policy. So that would be a very important task, to get them involved into disaster anti-disaster strategies, like those that are getting marginalized the most.
Teşekkür ederim.
Thank you very much. There is one more question to you, Ms. Schmidt. In Germany, what are the social policies that cover the pandemic process and the pre-pandemic process?
Yeah, it's a great question, because also I think in many countries it's the same. We have the authorities on the national and on the national level, and also on the level of the different federal states that have lots of responsibility in Germany, that may be specific, but also in other countries we have similar situations. But at the moment, I guess also for the population, it's that the different federal states have some specific regulations as well. So it's not, at the moment we have a shift so that we have on the whole level of the nation state regulations, but we have a high responsibility on the federal state, and that is discussed controversially as well. And yeah, we can see it from different sides. I would say that's also a great chance to get people involved, and also because the situations differs. I'm doing research in migration. That's why I choose examples from that field quite a lot. But for example, when we look at how people live that are getting categorized as migrants or refugees, how they live, the situation differs in the different federal states as well. So it makes sense to keep that in mind, and to have strategies that problematize, for example, very exclusive ways of accommodation in and during the pandemic. Yeah, so that's why we also always have to differ, like what's the regulation on nation state, what's the regulation in the federal states, and what's the local action in the neighborhood. So I don't know who asked that question, but we've seen that in many different regions, cities worldwide, that there's a lot of neighborhood support, for example. So yeah, I don't know if that if the question is answered well enough, but it's quite complex, like the subsidiarity system.
Peki, çok teşekkürler.
Okay, thank you very much. We ran out of time, but there is one very important question to Rory Trull. I'd like to ask that too. I'd really appreciate if you keep your answer short. During the pandemic, there were a lot of digital or online social work. Could they become permanent after the pandemic too, because they are more inexpensive? So what do you believe?
Well, that's absolutely the goal, is to be able to keep that level of inclusion and participation moving forward. We've never seen such a high level of participation in setting strategies and policies for the social work profession. We've been able to include voices from countries that haven't been able to afford to travel or have had visa restrictions to be in the past to attend meetings that set policy. So that whole dynamic has changed, and we now have to keep learning with the digital technology and keep it as inclusive as possible to enable as many social workers and as many people interested in shaping social work contributing to the discussion. So I very much hope that international colleagues will agree. It does mean that we'll have less face-to-face meetings for the few that can afford it, but I think it's a sacrifice of the greater good, and we'll keep these digital webinars going and meetings going. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This concludes session 1. We will have a 10-minute break, 10 or 12-minute break. Then we will proceed with session 2. Thank you very much for your participation. I also would like to thank the speakers. See you in session 2.